Okay, and admitting everybody now. Hi everybody, thank you for your patience in the waiting room. I'm just letting in the last few guests now, and then I'll let in anybody else who joins the waiting room after my brief introduction. Okay, last couple of guests coming in. Lovely. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you all tonight for this special discussion of Dr. Magnolia Cardona and Nurse Ebony Lewis's new book, When the Time Comes, Stories from the End of Life. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd just like to really quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join tonight's event. So you have all automatically been placed on mute, as you've no doubt noticed, but that doesn't mean that Magnolia and Ebony aren't keen to answer your questions. They've assured me that they definitely are, and we would love it if you could please start sending them through as and when you think of them using the chat box. It should be towards the lower left of your screen, but don't worry too much if you can't find it right now. I'm going to be using it to share the link with you all to purchase your copies of When the Time Comes. And when I do, it's going to pop up on your screen. So you can type the questions in there. They will come straight through to me and I will read them out later on in the evening for Magnolia and Ebony to answer. So lastly, we rarely have any technical issues, touch wood, but of course, sometimes we do. If we do, for whatever reason, one of our speakers drops out, we'll just take a brief pause while we wait to readmit them, and then we will resume the event as planned. And if one of you happens to drop out in the audience, then don't worry, please just use the same link that you used in the email to reconnect, and I'll make sure that I readmit you as soon as possible. And so I'd now like to introduce your speakers for this evening. Dr. Magnolia Cardona is a former GP, public health practitioner, and current Associate Professor of Health Services Research. She is a passionate advocate for the rights of older people dying of natural causes to not be overtreated with low-value care and instead have a dignifying end of life through aligning treatments with patients' values and planning in advance. Her controversial research with patients, families, and clinicians on this sensitive topic has attracted international media attention. Her goal is to improve the natural end-of-life experience for all. Nurse Ebony Lewis is experienced in emergency and geriatrics nursing, a skills combination that has made her highly aware of the needs of older people to be treated compassionately at a place of their choice, including their own home rather than in the emergency department environment or the intensive care unit. She loves talking to older patients, visiting them at home for their health assessments, and helping them express their values and preferences before they become critically ill. She is now undertaking her PhD studies on frailty. In conversation with Magnolia and Ebony tonight, we have Sally Piper. Sally is a Brisbane-based writer. Her debut novel, Grace's Table, was shortlisted for the 2011 Queensland Premier's Literary Award, Emerging Queensland Author category. Her second novel, The Geography of Friendship, was shortlisted for the 2019 Australian Book Industry Awards, Small Publishers Adult Book of the Year category. Her short fiction and non-fiction has appeared in various online and print publications in Australia, the UK and Ireland, to include a prize-winning short story in the One Book, Many Brisbane's anthology, Griffith Review, the Saturday Paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Weekend Australian, and other literary magazines and journals. And so, Sally, Magnolia, and Ebony, I'd now like to hand over to you all for tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Emma Kate. Just before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am this evening, which is the Turrbal and Yagara people, and to pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continuing connection to these lands for which sovereignty was never ceded. So, When the Time Comes, Stories from the End of Life, is a collection of deeply personal stories about end-of-life experiences. Some of the stories are written by individuals who are near or anticipating their own death. Others are by the family members, the carers, or healthcare workers. It's a book that isn't shy about its subject matter, and neither is it overly clinical. What it does is take readers by the hand and gently eases them through the thing that we as humans often find the most difficult topic of all to talk about: our own death or the death of those we love. It's a book that gives us the tools to open the way for these difficult conversations. It offers alternative ways of thinking about our end-of-life choices. And above all, it helps us find ways to ensure that we, or the people we care about, have the best possible end-of-life experience, ones that are personally tailored to individual wants and needs. Before we talk in depth about the book, I was just wondering, Magnolia and Ebony, if you could tell us how it is you came to be working in the respective fields that you do.
Yes. Thanks, Sally. Yes, over the years, both as part of our clinical and research work, we have witnessed how hospitals have shifted from those places where people used to come when they were acutely ill to get treated and get better, into places where now old, frail people are coming to die. I had worked as an emergency doctor in countries where there aren't too many resources, especially in healthcare. So we couldn't afford the luxuries of admitting people to critical care if they were clearly going to die. So then I came to Australia, and while doing research in intensive care units, I noticed the immense health resources that were being used to people whose prognosis was, to me, clearly very poor. And yet they were receiving intensive and costly treatments that weren't going to make any difference to their survival. So I asked the specialists why they were doing that. And they say, well, it's the uncertainty of if and when these people are going to die, whether they're going to die during this admission or in the next month. And so they told me if I could find a better way for us to predict their time to death, then they could do something different. So that's what gave me the impetus to start working on an evidence-based prognostic tool that identifies all the people who are at high risk of death during the hospitalization and who are probably not going to do very well after intensive care admission. So for those people, I was proposing we could have discussions, if appropriate, about redirecting their care towards palliation rather than to intensive care. So I presented this work in progress at an international conference in the US, and there was only standing room when my talks was announced. I then realized that there was a big need out there for this tool, and maybe I had to change my research focus and decided that day that I was going to move into this field to enhance prognostication of death and to lobby for the reduction of overtreatment near the end. And so it was during those subsequent investigations that I had the fortune to meet and hire Ebony Lewis as my research assistant.
Yeah. Thanks, Magnolia. For the past 6 years, I've largely worked around a program of research that Magnolia has been leading. She was just speaking about a few of those things that she was researching. And it's very much the research Magnolia and I have been doing is around improving the end-of-life care experience for older adults, families as well, and clinicians. And I'm also a registered nurse and have worked in the emergency departments. And as you can imagine, I saw a lot of deaths and end-of-life care take place. And this really sparked my interest around trying to improve the end-of-life experience for everyone involved. And I particularly enjoyed working with older people. And this has really led me to continue not only my research in this area, but now continuing my clinical work. So I'm working in general practice, and I also see patients in the community, in their homes. And I perform the older people's health assessments. And I've really enjoyed this a lot. and learning such a great deal from my patients, and particularly around issues that matter to older people. And of course, end of life has come into that a lot.
That's great. Thank you for giving us that entree into your careers. And death is an emotionally fraught subject, isn't it? You know, yet it's not unexpected. It's a given, we're all going to die. And yet while some people talk about it easily, there's others who are awkward or reluctant to talk about it. And then there are those who refuse to talk about it at all. And I was wondering, Magnolia, do you think this is because we talk about death and dying in the wrong way or at the wrong times in our lives, you know, that it's often not done until our hands are forced to have that discussion. And usually that's at the time of greatest emotional stress that we're being forced to make these decisions.
Yes, yes. You know, the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami said death is not the opposite of life, but an integral part of it. And yes, you're right in that often enough patients and families find themselves in a position where they have no choice but to hold these difficult conversations at a time of crisis. That obviously is not ideal and is very traumatic. And there are many personal, cultural, and professional reasons why people decide not to talk about it. We live in a death-averse society. So that's why this book tries to demonstrate through all the different stories that it's never too early to talk about and plan for when the time comes. And so when is a good time to raise the subject, you would wonder. And there are several opportunities. We may not see them, but I'll give you a few examples. Say, for example, you and your family are watching one of those emergency room TV shows or the Ambulance Australia or wherever. Then you can start casually chatting about what you would like for yourself if you were in the situation of those real people who are dying in the show, right? For example, would you like to be resuscitated? Or for example, when somebody from work or in the neighborhood or a relative of yours dies of a prolonged illness that causes too much pain and suffering and loss of dignity, then you may want to discuss with your close relatives what part of that treatment you would have considered unacceptable for yourself. Or if somebody in your family is diagnosed with a chronic condition that is irreversible, even before the condition becomes terminal, you could start a good discussion with them directly about what they would prefer to happen if they were to become critically ill. So one would hope these people would initiate the conversation themselves, but if not, then we can give them a tactful opportunity to talk about it over coffee or during a phone call or during a walk in the park. So all these situations offer us an opportunity to discuss their values and preferences, and why not our own.
Thank you. There's an overarching theme of courage right throughout your book, and courage in facing or accepting death, but also, and importantly, I think, having the courage to have that conversation that you were just giving us great examples of when we can raise it, and expressing what our end-of-life choices are, and then committing those thoughts to paper in an advanced care directive. And I wonder, Magnolia, for people who might not have heard of an advanced care directive before, if you could just give us an explanation of what that document is.
Yes, an advanced care directive is a document where a person who has mental capacity can put together in writing, perhaps with the assistance of a clinician, instructions on their wishes about treatments that they would approve or reject in case of future critical illness. So, for example, you may want to die at home or in a hospice instead of a busy emergency department. In this document, people can also state what they consider unacceptable. For example, CPR if they are in a permanent vegetative state, or what they're prepared to endure if they become too ill. For example, they want intensive care unit treatment if there is a chance of recovering. So an advanced care directive is a document that has two main purposes. One is to help the clinicians make decisions about what they can offer you or what they have to discontinue during critical illness in case you lose capacity and cannot participate in the decision. Because it may come a time when withholding or withdrawing treatment is the right and the most compassionate thing to do. And the second purpose of an advanced care directive is, as some people have described it, is a gift that you can give your families to spare them of the pain and the anguish of having to guess and make decisions on your behalf without knowing what you would have wanted. So, and just the last clarification I wanted is that the advanced care directives are not set in cement. Those documents are dynamic. So you can change your mind next month, or if new technology becomes available, or if you change your mind about having enough because the disease is too much, or if you just change your mind because as you grow older, your preferences change.
I was just thinking too, where would you access such a document? Like if a person coming away from our chat tonight, where would they be able to access such a document? Is it
For those
online?
people in Australia, Advanced Care Planning Australia has a range of documents because unfortunately for us, every state has a different type of document. Some are very long, some are shorter, and there are different types of documents for the different stages of your preparedness. So if you only want to talk about what you value, there is a statement of choices where you say, I value this, I value that, and you're not necessarily giving instruction about the treatments. But then there is the proper advanced care directive where you need a witness and probably a clinician helping you through it to make the decisions. They're all downloadable for free from the Advanced Care Planning Australia website.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. And many of us have wills. I think probably most people of a certain age certainly have a will, but I expect the experience of both of you is that fewer people have actually formalised an advanced care directive. And Ebony, I was wondering, is that because we're poorly informed about their existence, or is writing one just too difficult? It requires too much courage. What do you think?
It's a variety of factors, Sally, and you're right in saying as well, we do have a low uptake of advanced care directives in Australia. And just to give you an example, I think last year they did a big survey on adults in Australia. So I think it was around 50% had a will, but about 1 in 7 people in the community, this is what the research tells us, has a written advanced care directive, and about 1 in 4 in residential aged care. So again, why is this? I think a lot of it has to do is just simply not knowing about advanced care directives. And as Magnolia touched on as well, quite specific medical terminology in some of the forms, or a person may need help to fill out the forms. So this can also be a barrier. Laws around advanced care directive documentations and the types of forms, again, can differ between states and territories. And what I've also heard as well, and what is available also in the research from interviewing people, is that some people have expressed this hesitancy to put their preferences in writing, for example, thinking that they're signing a death sentence. And I think this is very much a result of being poorly informed about the role of advanced care directives.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, fearful. In chapter 3, there's a nurse writes about their experiences of caring for a terminally ill woman, and it's the woman's birthday, and all she wants to do for that day is to spend the time with her family. But she's obviously has a fairly high level of care required, and for the nurse to be able to enable her to do that, the nurse has to be able to restructure their workload in order to help fulfill the woman's wishes. And I'm an ex-nurse from a very long time ago, and what jumped out at me with this particular story in your book when I read it was that the nurse was able to restructure her workload for the day to accommodate this woman's wishes. And yet my experiences, even though it was a long time ago, was that I would love to have been able to do that on a lot of occasions, but the workload was such with the care of other patients that I just couldn't do that. And Ebony, it made me think, how much do poor end-of-life experiences rest with inadequate funding for staff and their training?
Yeah, I think a lot, Sally, and I remember this was a beautiful story, and it was so wonderful that this was able to happen for that patient. And exactly what you said, and I completely agree that we can't always restructure our workload, and particularly if we're looking after many patients or a lot of patients are really unwell. And I don't think we're alone in saying that, you know, we really wish we could be able to go that extra mile all the time. And this takes a toll on everyone. So yes, if we're going to be able to provide high quality end-of-life care, we need to provide our health professionals with adequate training opportunities in end-of-life care. And certainly we need sort of long-term solutions and appropriate funding. And particularly around nurse to patient ratios in a variety of settings. And I do really strongly want to see that improve, particularly in our residential aged care facilities. So we need to increase the skills mix. We need more registered nurses in these settings as well.
Vital, isn't it? In chapter 4, we hear from an end-of-life doula, and she or he speaks about the spiritual beliefs of people being as diverse as human personalities, which I thought was a beautiful way of describing the people in that person's care. But then the doula goes on to say that healthcare workers give too little attention to the spiritual care of their patients, and the focus is more on bodily care. And I think, harking back to my own nursing days, I think that is often the case. And Magnolia, I wondered if there's some in the audience who are probably unfamiliar with the term of a death doula or end-of-life doula, and I just wondered if you'd explain this person's role in end-of-life care, please.
Yes, thank you. That was actually a new concept for me too when I saw that story written and sent to me. These are doulas are compassionate people who understand the needs of the dying, and they have sort of completed a course on providing psychosocial and physical support to dying people and their families. So all of this happens in the sort of lead to a death. They also go to the aftermath, giving bereavement support to the families. So they can help with a wide range of services such as counseling, sharing information on local services, completing the advanced care directives, this is not too late, creating a legacy and life projects, conducting vigils, doing domestic chores, helping plan the funeral, helping relocate pets, etc. So they're like a good neighbor, if you like, who helps dying people and families in the transition, but they do that for a living, so they charge a fee for the service. And you can hire them for different periods from a few days to a number of weeks.
And do main hospitals, are they fairly familiar with the service that these people provide? Is it something we need to disseminate the information of their availability more into hospitals, do you think?
I don't think that they are integrated into the hospital care. Ebony, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are in the community. So the way I knew about them, for example, is by going to an annual expo on, it was called Live Well, Die Well. And there were lots of death doulas that day offering the services, giving me their card. And they have actually, some of them have published books or cartoons or whatever, posters to make people aware that they're available to take them, hold their hands through their difficult times. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they're part of the hospital service, and I don't think the hospitals advertise the service as much. Ebony, are you aware of any different?
No, and I'm based in Sydney, but I certainly haven't come across any death doulas in the hospitals I've worked at, or know of any who are working in there.
Hopefully we hear more of them. I've certainly heard of birth doulas, and it would be lovely to see that service go across the whole continuum of life, wouldn't it, from to life through to death. Some chapters in the book, they consider end-of-life choices from differing cultural and spiritual perspectives, and how these can actually be misunderstood or overlooked in some situations because of people caring for them from a different set of cultural or spiritual circumstances. And Ebony, I wondered if how do you think we can better recognise and incorporate differing cultural and spiritual beliefs into end-of-life choices and preferences in the care of our patients?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. And it's super important. So some of the things we can do where possible, we can involve cultural mentors, community health workers, religious leaders to work alongside the healthcare team with patients and their families. Really importantly, it's about training and education of staff providing care at the end of life in this sort of culturally responsive care. And it's very much having an understanding that culture and spirituality can influence a person's preferences and decisions around end of life. And what I've come across in training I've done myself and readings, it's particularly around being aware of our own beliefs, not to intentionally or even unintentionally force them on others, and not to make assumptions about people who come from a different culture to yourself, or will have differing spiritual or religious beliefs. And I think it's also really important to remember that there is also diversity within cultures or communities. So in brief, it's very much around embedding this cultural competence with the healthcare systems. And this will include tailoring of healthcare needs to meet our patients' needs.
Diversity of staff, isn't it? It's diversity right across the board. Yeah.
It really is.
Chapter 18 talks about the difficulties of being a carer, and this is something that struck a chord with me from a personal perspective, and the risk the role poses for the personal, emotional and social well-being of the carer. And Ebony, I wonder, how can we better support the needs of our home carers, given the vital role that they play? You know, they often care for these people well into their period of decreased physical function and mental function. And so how can we support these people to be able to keep the ones they love in their home for as long as possible?
Yeah, of course. And caregivers, carers are vital. And I can't remember what the exact number it was, but it's about 10% of our population are carers. And of course, very rewarding, but very stressful and demanding at times. So what can we do? Well, I think first we really need to emphasize this need for carers to look after themselves first and to watch for signs of burnout. So when we are just so exhausted physically and emotionally, and when we're safe to do so and where possible, making sure we just do these little things about resting and giving yourself a break, taking out some time to do some things that you enjoy and relaxing, if possible, and if your circumstances permit, sharing the workload with other family members. And I think most importantly is really seeking support when needed. So for instance, speaking to your local general practitioner or the healthcare team specialists. Now, there are support services available through some of the larger organisations. So for instance, Dementia Australia, they have information on support services on their websites, and they also organise regular meetups with carers to get together. However, I'm not sure what's happening with the current restrictions. There's also carer organisations in most states and territories. And there's also My Aged Care. And for eligible people, so you need to go through the eligibility criteria and process, you may be able to access respite. And there is also emergency respite if needed.
It's interesting you mentioning the carer support groups. I had a friend in the UK and her mother used that, and it was pivotal to her being able to maintain her husband, caring for her husband with Alzheimer's at home. So it's about people helping each other, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is, yeah.
In chapter 13, a nurse remarks, she or he says, our undergraduate training on breaking bad news or spelling out the dying process for patients had been minimal. I believe the entire experience involved a few hours over a couple of weeks. And I know from my own experience that that's true from my own training, but it's a pretty frightening admission, isn't it, Magnolia? I wondered if you'd like to speak to that.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think she was lucky in the medical courses. Sometimes in some medical schools, it just confined to a couple of hours for the entire 5 or 6 year training program. So, the job of the doctors, especially in the next few years, where by 2050, 1 in 3 people will be aged 65 years and above, we're going to have to learn how to communicate these news. And so what doctors are doing after they graduate is they learn on the job by trial and error, or by watching some more experienced clinicians, or by doing courses or attending workshops or self-learning. So, and I said unfortunately because, all these avalanche of deaths of older people are going to come up, and we're going to have to be, the new generations will have to be responsible for breaking the bad news and taking people through the journey. So I just hope that medical and nursing schools reconsider and revise the curriculum to increase the student exposure to this important skill. But if that doesn't happen, there are currently many online resources, such as the End of Life Essentials, which is a training program for free online, and the clinicians can do sort of separate modules when they have a chance, and they sort of do little practices and have case scenarios, etc. So they can do that as part of their professional development to be able to do this better in the future.
It's almost like we need a university doula who goes into these institutions and brings their unique perspective to having these conversations, and having carers come in and actually having these people who are at the coalface of healthcare, having this great variety of different people who can speak from their own personal experience instead of, as you say, learning on the job. Yeah,
that's a great innovation we could suggest to universities.
I think so. And because it's about being on the front foot, isn't it? I mean, with those statistics you just gave us, but I bet you're not seeing anyone sort of proactively addressing what's going to be a real neglect soon in the study, in the training of people. And so it'd be lovely to see a bit of proactivity to get that happening.
Yes.
There's a recurring theme in many of this, in fact, really all the stories in the collection. And, well, not all of them, a lot of them anyway. And it seems to be that there's sometimes a lack of honesty, or there's a lack of truth, or a lack of clear messaging. It's either by about the clinical situation or the options available to people. And it's a lack that occurs between healthcare workers and their patients or their families. But it also is a lack that occurs between the dying and their families and carers. It's not just necessarily the healthcare workers. And it often felt to me when I was reading through the different stories that the only thing separating a good death from a bad one was an honest and open conversation about the reality of the situation. And Magnolia, I wondered what your thoughts are about this and how can that deficit be addressed?
Yeah, Sally, I totally agree that an open conversation with patients and families could help the patient have the treatment that is more aligned with their wishes. But of course, this should only be done to the extent that the patient wants to know. We cannot force information on patients if they're too afraid of it. So some people prefer to be oblivious to prognosis and don't want to hear about the statistics, and that point of view should be respected. But if the family is aware that the death is coming over the next few months or weeks, then they have an opportunity to say their goodbyes. They can spend time together. They can reschedule their lives around the dying person. They can help clinicians towards the end to not provide treatments that the patient wouldn't have wanted. So now the absence of these conversations doesn't just happen at home and the hospitals, and could be addressed mainly by doing two things. One is, again, better training of clinicians in delivering the bad news and in supporting the patients through the aftermath. And by giving clinicians tools to predict the time to death, because that uncertainty is what stops them from initiating this discussion, right? So it's not always feasible for all conditions, but there is always uncertainty in medicine, but there are a range of tools out there for different conditions now, where clinicians can more or less predict the number of months the person has to live, and they can use that as a trigger to start these conversations, right? And as I mentioned before, we have developed, refined, and validated this prognostic tool that flags the patients who are at highest risk of dying in hospital or in the next 3 months. And this can be useful for clinicians to start the discussion, and also for patients who wants to know prognosis really, honestly.
And I'd say this is one of your tools too. Your book is one of those new tools. In chapter 19, it talks about the death of loved ones during the pandemic with the lockdowns, with the COVID lockdowns, and having the opportunity to say goodbye is an important part of the grieving process, as we all know, and it's been something that has been denied many, many people during the pandemic. And Magnolia, I wondered if you knew of any special bereavement arrangements that have been put in place to help families who've not had the opportunity to be with loved ones or to attend their funerals during COVID-19, and if so, if any of these measures were transferable to helping loved ones in other situations of loss and grief as well.
Right, yes, yes. I'm aware that during the pandemic lockdown in European countries, for example, in the US, doctors and nurses had to become very creative in terms of keeping families in touch with the patients who were going to die in isolation. So iPads and video phone calls became very commonplace. And other services provided visitors with a full personal protective equipment. That visits were still restricted to one person, the same person every time for a very limited time. And some services even, and in Australia, I think this happened to rearrangement of the entry and exit to the different wards so people couldn't go back. So there is a possibility of the visiting, but at the same time, there is low risk of contaminating other patients if you come from the street. So however, in other places, patients had to die alone, unfortunately, and this was very sad. And they had to die in the company of a nurse who was holding their hand. And that was also, that obviously leads to complicated grief in the families, but also a lot of burden on the staff at hospitals and residential aged care. So in Australia, there are some not-for-profit organizations, such as the Wesley Mission, who provided confidential mental health support and linkages with health professionals and referrals and practical assistance to anybody who was over the age of 16 and had been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. But also Palliative Care Australia developed written recommendations for policymakers, for health services, for aged care leaders, and for professional bodies to use some discretionary powers about who was to be allowed visitors towards the end and under what circumstances, because there was no book about this before the pandemic. It all had to be put together during the global crisis.
Mm. It's interesting, you touch on sort of volunteer services there. And is that something we in routine in aged care facilities or even hospitals, is that something we tap into, that resource of volunteers, of people who are just willing and wanting to come around and perhaps sitting with people and talking with them? Is that something we tap into in our healthcare system much?
There is a sort of a worldwide movement called Compassionate Communities. And it's sort of a bunch of volunteers who have websites and Twitter and all these social media platforms, inviting other people to be on rosters to help people under different circumstances, not just when they're dying, but in these cases as well. So let's say the neighbors who would choose a time to go and cook or clean or help the person or give them a shower, etc. But Ebony would be probably in a better position to talk about this because she has had more exposure to residential aged care facilities than I have.
Yeah, so certainly. And for the residential aged care facilities that I've worked with, there certainly has been a number of volunteers who dedicate their time, and they're just fantastic people. They'll come in, they will help with the lunches with patients, not so much with the showering and everything like that, but this is more, around feeding, around meal times, sitting with the patients. We have volunteers in the community who will go around just for the love of it and take patients to appointments and so forth. And also where I am in Sydney, we have got quite a few volunteers who are working a bit more out in the Blue Mountains, about 2 hours out of Sydney, and they do a fantastic job working with the community palliative care team. They go in with the palliative care team first in the community, they get to know the person, they just run through some of the basic sort of medical issues. And then they see these patients, I think it was around a weekly basis. And then this can also increase more if the patient needs it. Unfortunately, though, with COVID, a lot of the volunteers and so forth have been put on hold, particularly in our aged care facilities. I'm not too familiar what's happening, though, in the community. I think those would still probably be going ahead, possibly.
Yeah, well, many things have been put on hold with COVID, haven't they? And it's a shame that one has as well. I know it's also limited just the activities that are available to people in, like with my parents, in independent living, and I'm sure it's had the same effect with people in residential care facilities as well. That engagement with others has been limited also. But just right from the outset, the beating heart of this collection is about ensuring people have a good death. And it made me want to know what a good death looks like for you. If both of you would like to answer that.
Ebony, you go first.
Yeah. Well, a good death. So I guess it's personal. It can be very different for each person. But I guess a few of the key points of what a good death would look like for me would be really having a sense of control in what my end of life looks like. And where possible, being able to have a say in what treatments I would want, or more importantly, what treatments I would not want, that are aligned with my values. I don't want unnecessary suffering if I can avoid it. Where possible, I want to be free of pain, and also not prolonging my life if it's greatly going to reduce my quality of life. And I hope this is really important to me, that my family accepts that my time has come when my time comes. But I also just want to make note as well is that people's preferences may change over the life course. So I might have these preferences now, and certainly I see this in clinical practice. I'll have patients say to me, you know, I've wanted this or I've wanted that, or this is what I value in life, and things do change. So I'm very well aware of that too. But I think really this notion of having a good death is definitely achievable. But we just need to really start normalizing these end of life conversations. We need to discuss and document our preferences for future healthcare with our loved ones, our doctors, and so forth, for this to happen well.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I mean, a good death is not a contradiction in terms. A good death to me would include being told the truth from the beginning. I want to know as early as possible about my chances of survival. And I know there is uncertainty, but some kind of idea of how long I have to live. Because having enough time will, I'll be able to prepare my affairs to finalize or update my will. I have updated my advance care directive like 5 times in the last 20 years, but I know as we grow older, we may change our mind, but there is one thing that I haven't changed my mind about is I don't want to be a burden on anybody, the health system or my family or my neighbors or anybody. So I want to be able to choose the place where I'd like to die, and it's not necessarily a hospital or my home. And I want to have clinicians who are proficient at controlling pain and breathlessness and the anxiety that comes with knowing that you're dying. And I want to be able to listen to my favorite music as I peacefully die.
It's just with both what you're both saying is that, and getting back to the advanced care directive, it's not a one-off, is it? It is, because we do change right throughout our lives, and they are a document that you have to keep visiting over and over again. And they're conversations that you have to keep having over and over again with your family, so that it's always in keeping with your stage in life, really. Yeah. Now, you have the great fortune of the wonderful Norman Swan having written the afterword in your book, and I think he's the man on everyone's lips in Australia, so that it's a beautiful, fitting afterword by him. And I wondered, just to close off our questions before we go on to the Q&A with our audience, if one of you would like to read Norman Swan's afterword, please.
I can read it. I have the book right in front of me.
Thanks, Ebony.
I'll just look through it. Okay, so the afterword, where to from here? When we're healthy and well, it's hard to imagine that something bad can happen to us at any time. A diagnosis of cancer, a car crash, a stroke. We might be unaware of what's occurred, but our families have to deal with the aftermath and decide on our behalf what should happen next. Another round of chemo, prolonged ventilation, tube feeding, another operation, or intravenous antibiotics. The evidence is that all too much is done to us when it's known that death is imminent, and that if we'd been able to be asked, we'd have refused. Pity the poor children or spouses who are left to wonder and argue over what their father, mother, wife, husband, brother, sister would have really wanted. The personal cost to families and the economic cost to the nation are huge. The stories you've just read in this book should inspire you to start having critical conversations in your family about each other's wishes at the end of life, when care might be futile, painful, and even perhaps life-shortening. It's been shown in some research that appropriate palliative care can in fact extend life and better quality of life at that. Then document what you've agreed and make sure everyone knows about it, including your GP. And if you're a GP reading this, again, the evidence suggests that your patients want you to bring this up, yet only a small percentage of you do. Death is part of life and it should be as good as life, not the horror that it can be needlessly if we'd only planned ahead.
That's a fantastic afterword. And Emma Kate, I think we'll hand over to see if you have any questions for us.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. We have had a few questions come through. I'll try and get through as many as I can. So the first has come from Teresa, and Teresa wants to know what percentage split of patient advocacy do you think falls on patients, nurses, patient family, friends, and doctors? And Teresa also wants to know, is there a hierarchy of interprofessional collaboration, e.g. nurse to doctor, agency to critical care team, that might stymie open discussion between all parties to align as patient-centric? So whoever would like to start first.
I can give it a try. Thank you for the question. I personally don't think we should compartmentalize the responsibilities in sort of measurable ways. I think talking about good deaths and preparing somebody for it should be everybody's responsibility. So I think, for example, the public can help by not requesting extreme treatments and doing everything because technology is there to be used. And doctors could help by raising the issue and the conversations early with the family. And families could talk to the patients, their own relatives, about what they want early enough. And universities and specialist colleges could contribute by giving more training in communications to people. The media could help by sort of normalizing the end of life conversation. So I'm not sure that we should say 20% should be this person and 10% should be this other group. And in relation to multidisciplinary collaboration, that's ideal, but we see that currently in hospitals, and this is not specific to Australia, specialists work in silos. So the kidney doctor and the heart doctor and the brain doctor. And yes, there is problems with some of them want to do more and some of them want to stop. And that's one of the reasons why the default position of doing more continues to happen. So yes, it would be ideal if we could do this. And it would be ideal if we could break these barriers about hierarchy of the doctor is the one who starts the conversation. In other countries, very successfully, the nurses and the social workers start the conversations. And they're actually in a better position to do it because they know the patient better. They spend more hours with the patient. They know the ins and outs of their routine, whereas the specialist comes for 5 minutes and leaves. So in Australia, we don't have that good fortune yet, and we're trying, and we have published sort of commentary papers and opinion pieces saying, let's take the opportunity of the pandemic, for example, because there is a shortage of doctors because they're busy treating the doctors. Let's get the nurses and the social workers starting these conversations. I hope I answered the question, but Ebony, do you want to add something?
And just going on that, I think it is slowly moving, and we do see more opportunities now, and particularly in primary care, with nurses being able to start these conversations. So I do a lot of the 75-year and over health assessments on older patients in the home, as I was saying before as well. And one of the questions we talk about is around advanced care planning. So that's a great opportunity for me to start talking about it with the patients. So I think there are little opportunities which are coming about, which I'm really excited about. And that it doesn't just fall onto one specialty or the patient or the doctor. So again, it is definitely the responsibility of everyone.
Thank you both. Alexandra is wondering if you could explain the difference between ACP and ACD. And Alexandra asked, what is the status of them and are they legally binding?
Ebony?
Yes, yes. Well, certainly in New South Wales, where I'm based, advanced care directives are legally binding, and I'm pretty sure that is we go for most states. Magnolia, if it's not for Queensland, please correct me. Now, the difference between an advanced care directive, again, it's a written documentation, it's legally binding, and the person has to have decision-making capacity when they are writing it. Advanced care planning can also be done when someone has lost decision-making capacity. So for instance, if it was a relative or something who had dementia, they were admitted into a residential aged care facility, you will hopefully be starting the advanced care planning process, and you can have documents around what you think the person's values or preferences were. So it's very much more around the substitute decision maker or the family being able to at least put something in place for that facility. And with advanced care planning, advanced care directives, the writing on that is just one part of advanced care planning. So advanced care planning is very much a process where you're discussing with your healthcare teams about everything from where you want your care received to speaking very much around sort of family and health team involvement. So it's a process.
Yeah, and advanced care planning is like a package of which advanced care directive is a part, but advanced care planning can also include a not for resuscitation order, or if the person lives in a residential aged care facility, then not for transfer to hospital, because the patient has decided they've had enough, they want to die in the home.
Thank you both. And the last question for this evening comes from Meg. And Meg wants to know if, aside from this book of yours, are there any other books that you would both recommend for practical and emotional support? Maybe you could take turns recommending your favorites.
Yeah. I want you to look at my library behind me. It's a virtual background, but it's actually my library at home. So I have a little book to recommend there that is called We're All Going to Die. And it's written by a Melbourne doctor, GP, who was really afraid of death as she was sort of doing the medical course. And this is a book about her journey of stopping being afraid of death into now talking to all her patients about how to plan a good death. This obviously depending on your taste and your preference and your time. This little book that is called Dying to Know is a book of pictures with little sort of quotes in each of them to give you time to think about things. And they show you a coffin and they show you playing with your grandpa and things like that, and sort of give you little things to think about every day. And it's kind of a happy book. And it's also very informative. But there's also a little bit more sort of, I wouldn't say gruesome, but more raw kind of writing in Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, where he talks about, what really happens when you die, what happens to the body physically. And he goes through all these very detailed descriptions of what happens to your body. So it depends on what you want to know. There are plenty of resources, very luckily for us out there, about death and dying, and all of these I think are contributing to normalizing the conversation. Yeah. Ebony, you had any recommendations?
Oh, definitely Immortal. that was something that really appealed to me. But there's several books, and I think Magnolia's got them all behind her as well, on her bookshelf. But also just to bring up the Dying to Know book as well, they also have several games you can play within the book as well. So they've got a lot of resources just practically around starting the conversation. But I also just want to say as well, in our book, if you're after a book which is looking at resources as well, we've also got quite an extensive list of resources around advanced care planning, advanced care directives, not even in Australia, UK, America, and also other relevant reading if something in the chapter has sparked your interest.
There is something, I don't know if you can see because I got a virtual background, it's very hard to show. Can you see this?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, this is a game that is promoted by a hospice, Calvary Hospice in, I think it's Victoria. And it's basically a series of cards and they have questions at the back, like what would you want people to say or not say about you at the funeral? And what is your idea of a good death? and what are your thoughts about organ donation and things like that. And you can play this over coffee with your friends when they visit. And this is another good way of, this is a conversation starter. This is a very good sort of easy way to break the ice.
Lovely. Thank you both so much, Ebony and Magnolia and Sally. This has been such a fantastic, insightful conversation, and one that I know from the questions that have come through from the audience has been really helpful for a lot of people. Before we conclude for the evening, I just want to ask if you have any final comments that you'd like to make, or Sally, if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask. We have time for probably one more.
I see this as a book that okay, I'll make it very quick. I guess I want to know how we're going to get this book into everyone's hands. Beyond the bookshop, where do you see it popping up, this book, within your workplaces or other workplaces? It's almost a type of book that needs to be just left on the kitchen bench at home as well. So I was just wondering if you had any ideas of how you would like to see this book appear within the community.
Yeah, I was envisaging the book to be purchased by GPs and be in the waiting room. So because the stories are so short, people while they're waiting to be called by the doctor can read one story. And every story has reflection questions at the end. So to get people thinking, and maybe when they close that book and the doctor calls them, they would be asking the questions of the doctor about, the book that they just read a chapter of. I also envisage them to be in intensive care unit waiting rooms for people to start considering whether it is time for the family to discuss these things. And of course, in medical schools as a textbook, it would be wonderful. It could be used to teach people the sort of things that the society expects of them when they have to have the conversation. Ebony?
Yeah, definitely the universities. That's one of my goals currently. But also as well, I think it'd be fantastic for medical students, nursing students, allied health students as well, because it does have the reflection questions at the end as well. So you could just pick up a chapter. And also the great thing about this book is you don't have to read it from the start to finish. You can have a look at it. You pick up the chapter that may interest you. They're short stories. It doesn't take too long. But then we've got, after every chapter, reflection questions. So I think it'd be also a really good learning resource for our young medical students and nursing students.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Ebony and Magnolia. Sally, I can't see you right now, have you? And Sally, hopefully I can... Oh, there you are. Yes, you are back. Lovely.
I did pop out there for a while unintentionally.
Well, I'm glad that you are still here. Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I have posted the link that you can use to grab your copies of When the Time Comes in the chat box. I'm going to share it one last time there for you all in case anybody's missed it. Yeah, please do purchase your copies.
And can I just say, Emma Kate, that all royalties from the sale of this book support research to improve end of life for older people, which is fantastic. Thank you, Magnolia and Ebony, for that gesture.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I hope that you've had a lovely evening, and I hope that that we see you again soon at one of our events shortly. And Ebony and Magnolia, I can't wait to see how this book goes in the world, and I have no doubt that it's going to make a huge difference in many, many people's lives. So thank you both.
I really hope so.
Thank you, Emma Kate.
Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.